Hi, it's Grace. Welcome back to Emposia Book Club. So in the first 3 months of 2021, I read 65 books, which is quite a lot. So today I'm going to be bringing you my 5 tips on how to read more, as well as the one bonus tip that just completely changed the way I was thinking about my reading, and I think it's a thing that's helped me the absolute most. So obviously, little disclaimer, reading isn't a race. It doesn't matter how many books you read. I definitely wasn't like trying to read as many books as possible, but when people find out how many books I've read, often they do ask for tips and advice on how to read more, so stay tuned for my top tips. So the first tip is to track your reading. This is something I only started doing in 2019, and that is the year that my reading took a huge uptick. I think that tracking your reading helps for a few reasons. You can do it on Goodreads, Storygraph, or just on like a tracking spreadsheet, however you want. It is an aspect of holding yourself accountable. I am someone who's incredibly competitive with myself, so if I set myself a reading challenge goal for the year on Goodreads or on Storygraph, I then want to hit that. Plus, tracking your reading is just fun. Like I say, you get a lot of information about yourself. It's also really social if you do use an app, because you can see what everyone else is reading and just be a lot of fun. So tip number 2 is potentially the most obvious, but it's one that I always come back to when people ask me how I read so much, and that is just to use dead time to read or to set time aside. So it totally depends on your schedule. You know, everyone's different, the way that your days pan out, but either being like every evening between 7 and 6, if you set aside a piece of time that you're like, I'm gonna read every day on your commute. That was always a big one for me. I would read on my commute. When I first started getting back into reading a lot, I was like, I'm going to use that 40 minutes a day to read. On the other hand, if you don't have such a fixed schedule, what I do is just use any sort of dead time to read. So if I am in a waiting room, on a train, have 5 minutes, 10 minutes between activities, I just use that time to read. And I think sometimes we can get in our heads and be like, you need to have a nice hour-long set aside with your candle, with your reading blanket. And that is lovely to read under those circumstances, but it doesn't have to be like that. And I think oftentimes if you're waiting for the perfect moment to read, you're just kind of putting it off. Whereas if you get into the habit of just picking up a book whenever you have time, you'll realize you're reading so much more. Tip 3 kind of ties into that idea of just always having a book on hand to pick up and read, because I think another thing that really helps is to have a mix of mediums when you're reading, so that there's always something available to read, but also that maybe you don't get bored. I read most of my books physically, but I do love audiobooks for very specific tasks. So if I'm exercising, if I'm cleaning, tidying, doing jobs around the house that involve my body and not my mind, I'll always listen to an audiobook. But then I have my phone and my Kindle for when I'm out on the go. So definitely having a mix. Also, some people just prefer to read via audio, prefer to read via ebook. I think trying out the different mediums, seeing which one works for you, but also if you can be flexible with your mediums and with your reading, it just means that there's always the opportunity to pick something up, even if you are running and can't hold a book, or out for the day and can't fit a book in your bag. So tip number 4 is choose your books wisely. Again, it sounds obvious, but do not try and force yourself to read something that you're not enjoying. I think if you push on through a book that you're not enjoying, you're just going to end up in a reading slump, and it isn't going to make you want to read anymore. Whereas if I just put that down, picked up something else, you can always come back to that, but you're not letting that momentum of reading stop just because you're not enjoying a book. And I think as a little kind of extra, if you are in a bit of a slump, or if everything you're picking up you're not enjoying, you're finding it quite uninspiring, some of my favorite things to do is to reread a favorite book. It's still getting you in that habit of reading. It's still, you know, you are still reading it even if you've read it before, but it's safe, it's familiar, you know you're going to enjoy it, and then that might make you feel a bit more inspired. Something else perhaps, maybe if you're a bit newer to reading, try picking up a book which has been adapted into a film or TV show that you really like, because again, you have that sense of familiarity with the story, you know you're probably going to enjoy it, and it's just a nice way to ease yourself in. And tip number 5 is to make it social. If you are struggling to get the motivation to read, then make it part of an activity you're doing with your friends. Join a book club. That could be an online book club that actually physically meet, or even just a book club where they've chosen a book and everyone reads it in their own time and you can kind of get involved or not. You could also buddy read with a friend. This is a great way, because if you and your friend have agreed to read a book in a certain amount of time, it's going to be much harder, I think, for you to procrastinate, because you don't want to let your friend down, but also you'll be looking forward to talking to your friend about it. And like I say, engaging with bookish social media, if that's something that you enjoy. I love using Bookstagram and BookTube to hear other people talking about books, because if they talk about a book that sounds amazing, it makes makes me so inspired and want to read it. And if I'm getting like 5 to 10 recommendations a month, I just feel like, oh, I want to read more because I want to get to this next book that sounds really exciting. So they were my top 5 tips. My little bonus tip, which might not be for everyone, but for me, it totally, like I say, revolutionized the way I was reading, is to pick your next book before you finished the book you're reading. This doesn't have to be like a huge planned TBR. I know some people are mood readers, but if you're getting to like the very end of your book, just think about what you might be excited to pick up next, because I am such an indecisive person. If I've just already thought, oh, that's the book that I'm really excited to read next, it means you can more seamlessly move into your next read. It doesn't have to be straight away, but I am the sort of person where if I haven't thought about what I might want to read next, I could waste a day, a couple of days trying to choose that next book. Whereas now I just always have in the back of my head maybe 1 or 2 books that I'm like, I'm really, really excited to read you. And it just means that I finish a book and I pick up the next book and don't waste so much time in a state of indecision. Also, Emposia has a 40 tips for how to read more guide. So we'll link that down below if you want even more tips. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.